green bean casserole was already in the oven when I heard him say it. Not screamed, not argued, just said, the way you'd mention you needed to stop for gas on the way home. Casual, rehearsed maybe, like he'd been holding the sentence in his mouth for weeks and finally just let it fall out onto the kitchen counter between the good china and the gravy boat his grandmother left us. I think we should talk about ending this. Tonight. Before everyone gets here. I had a wooden spoon in my hand. I remember that detail very clearly. I set it down on the rest beside the stove, the one I'd specifically bought because I didn't want grease rings on the counter. I turned around slowly. Tonight, I said. You're calmer when there are people around. That was what he said. That was his reasoning. He wanted to do it with an audience arriving in 40 minutes because he thought the social pressure would keep me from reacting. He had thought this through. He had planned it like a logistics problem, and the solution he'd landed on was Christmas Eve dinner for 11 people, my own slow cooker going on the counter, his mother's Cobbler recipe I'd spent 3 hours on the day before. I looked at him for a long moment. He looked back at me with the expression of a man who had already moved on in his head, who was just waiting for the paperwork of this conversation to be completed so he could get to whatever was next. Okay, I said. He blinked. Okay? I heard you. I turned back to the stove and checked the oven temperature. His name is Owen. We'd been married 4 years, together for 6 before that, which means I was 23 when we started dating, which means he is woven into almost the entire decade of my 20s, which means I am telling you this with the full awareness that I built a significant portion of my adult identity inside a relationship with a man who chose Christmas Eve to tell me he was done. We met at a work conference in Nashville. He was in corporate real estate. I was 2 years into my job as a project manager at a mid-size architecture firm. We both reached for the last coffee at the networking breakfast, and he said, "Go ahead," and I said, "No, you," and we stood there for 20 seconds doing that thing people do until he laughed and poured us each half a cup. I thought that was charming. I thought a lot of things about Owen were charming for a long time. He was good at first impressions, effortlessly so. His family was the same way, warm at the door, great at dinner table conversation, the kind of people who made you feel immediately included and slightly off balance at the same time. His mother, who I will call her what she always insisted I call her, which was just Connie, sweetheart, had a way of looking at you that felt like approval and assessment simultaneously. I spent years trying to earn something from that woman that she was never going to give me. I understand that now. I didn't understand it for a long time. When Owen and I got engaged, Connie cried. Happy tears, she said. She hugged me and called me her second daughter. At the rehearsal dinner, she gave a toast that mentioned Owen's accomplishments 9 times and mentioned me twice, once to mispronounce my last name. My name is Hadley. I mention that because Owen's family called me variations of it for years, Hallie, Holly, once inexplicably Hartley, and Owen never corrected them. He'd squeeze my hand under the table like that was the same thing. I had left my job 8 months before that Christmas Eve. This is the part I want to be honest about because it's the part I'm least proud of. Not because it was wrong, but because I let someone else's certainty override my own, and I knew better, and I did it anyway. Owen had been promoted to regional director the previous spring. His territory expanded to cover 3 states. He traveled constantly, Sunday through Thursday most weeks, sometimes longer. We'd talked about what this would mean, and somewhere in those conversations, which always seemed to happen late at night when I was tired, the idea emerged that it would be easier if I wasn't working a demanding job simultaneously. That someone needed to be the one holding things together at home, that his income was now more than enough. I want to be clear that he never said quit your job. He said things adjacent to that. He asked how I'd feel about taking a breath. He wondered aloud if I'd ever thought about doing freelance consulting, something with more flexibility. He pointed out that the commute was wearing me down. He did this the way very skilled people do things, not with pressure, but with persistent, gentle suggestion, the kind that doesn't feel like pressure because it comes from someone who loves you and is just asking questions. I gave notice in April. I told myself I was making a choice, a partnership decision. I told myself I'd pick up consulting work, that I'd have time to develop the proposal I'd always wanted to submit for the firm's community design initiative, that 6 months of breathing room would actually be good for me. I did some of those things. I also spent a lot of that year driving to his parents' house to help Connie with things she couldn't manage alone, and planning his office's summer barbecue because his assistant had quit, and learning from scratch how to make every dish his family requested for every gathering so that nobody could say I didn't try. The cobbler I'd made the night before Christmas Eve was from Connie's recipe. I'd called her twice to clarify the instructions. I'd made a test version the week before to get the crust right. Owen knew all of this. He still picked Christmas Eve. His sister and her husband arrived first, then his parents, then his cousin and the cousin's new girlfriend who I'd never met, then his college friend Theo and Theo's wife. I'd made enough food for all of them and then some. The standing rib roast that had been in my cart for 2 weeks and cost more than I'll say here, the twice-baked potatoes, the green bean casserole, the glazed carrots his mother specifically requested every year, the rolls I'd started from scratch that morning because Connie had mentioned once, 3 years ago, that she preferred homemade. I had set the table with the tablecloth we'd gotten as a wedding gift. I'd put out the good glasses. Owen was excellent that evening, warm, engaged, refilling drinks, laughing at the right moments. I watched him move through our living room and thought about how good he was at the surface of things. I kept moving too. I checked on the roast. I refreshed the appetizer tray. I answered the question about whether the glazed carrots had orange zest from his aunt, who had opinions about orange zest. I smiled at his mother when she walked into the kitchen and said the roast smelled wonderful and then said almost in the same breath that the good silver was her grandmother's and she'd always assumed it would stay in the family. I held the ladle I was using for the gravy. "Of course," I said. "We can talk about that whenever you'd like." She smiled. It was the smile that meant she'd said what she came to say. At dinner, Owen sat at the head of the table. I sat at the other end. His mother was to his right, which was where she always sat, because she'd once mentioned it was the spot she preferred, and Owen had arranged every dinner seating for 4 years around that preference. The conversations overlapped each other the way they always did. Real estate, someone's renovation, a family friend's son who had done something impressive or scandalous, both being equally interesting to this family. I listened. I ate very little. The roast was good. I knew it was good. Theo's wife, her name is Blythe, leaned toward me at one point and said quietly, "This is the best meal I've had in years. I'm serious." "Thank you," I said. "I'm really glad." I meant it. That part I meant completely. After the main course, Owen stood up. I thought he was going to toast Christmas, which he did sometimes, a short, warm thing that made everyone feel good. He picked up his glass. He looked around the table. He looked at me last. "I want to share something with everyone," he said, "since we're all together." I put my fork down. "Hadley and I have talked, and we've both decided that it's time for us to go our separate ways." Complete silence. Then his mother said, "Oh, we know, honey." And that was the moment I understood that everyone at the table, or almost everyone, had known before they sat down, before they walked through my door, before they ate the roast I'd been preparing since yesterday morning, and the rolls I'd made from scratch in the cobbler that was still cooling on the kitchen counter. They had known. They had come anyway. They had eaten the meal anyway. Blythe was the only one who looked genuinely shocked. She looked at me with an expression I recognized. The particular helplessness of being the only person in the room who didn't know what everyone else knew. She opened her mouth slightly. I shook my head, once, almost imperceptibly. I stood up. I picked up my glass of wine. I looked at Connie, who was already smoothing the tablecloth in that way she had, like she was tidying up after the inconvenience of what had just happened. "I hope you enjoy the rest of the evening," I said. "The cobbler is on the counter. I made it from your recipe, Connie. I think I finally got the crust right." I took my wine and I walked upstairs. I heard the murmur of conversation resume below me, slowly at first, then normal volume within 2 minutes. I sat on the edge of the bed in the room I had decorated and the house I had managed, and I thought with remarkable clarity, I am not staying in this house tonight. I made 2 phone calls. The first was to my friend Dara, who has been my best friend since the 7th grade and who answered on the second ring and said, when I told her in 1 sentence what had happened, "I'm already getting my keys." The second call was to my sister Noelle, who lived 40 minutes away. She answered and I said, I need to tell you something, and then I need you to be normal with me for a few minutes before I have to go." She was. She is very good at that. She asked about the roast and whether I'd use the thermometer, and when I said yes, she said good, because I always ran it too hot in the early years, and I laughed, which was what she intended. Dara arrived in 31 minutes. I had packed one bag. I had taken my laptop, my external hard drive with my freelance files, both passports, the folder of documents I kept in the nightstand, financial records, insurance, our lease, the copy of the prenuptial agreement that Owen had suggested and I had signed, and which, as it turned out, I had read much more carefully than he'd assumed. I also took the good silver. Connie could take that up with my attorney. I want to tell you about the prenuptial agreement for a moment because it matters. Owen had proposed it 18 months into our engagement. He said it was just practical. He had assets coming into the marriage. His parents had strongly suggested it was just paperwork. I said okay. I hired my own attorney, which Owen thought was unnecessary, but I had been raised by a woman who worked in a courthouse for 22 years and who told me once, when I was 16, that the people who ended up in the worst positions were always the ones who hadn't read the thing they signed. So I read it. My attorney read it. We requested 3 modifications, which Owen's attorney pushed back on, and we held firm on 2 of them. Owen was impatient during this process, but he agreed. The 2 modifications I held firm on were these. First, that any business I started during the marriage would be considered separate property if I had originated the concept and held majority ownership. Second, that if either party sought divorce, the requesting party would be responsible for initiating the formal process and bearing the initial legal costs. He had said, at the time, that these were fine. Of course, just paperwork. Here's the thing about the freelance consulting I'd been doing since I left my job. I had not, actually, been doing small hourly consulting the way I'd initially imagined. What had started as occasional project management work for a former colleague had grown, in 8 months, into something else. I had 3 ongoing clients. I had recently taken on a 4th. 2 of those clients were mid-size firms who paid monthly retainers. I had formalized it in September, registered the business, opened a separate business account. Owen knew I was doing some consulting. He did not know the scope of it. He hadn't asked in several months, and I hadn't offered, and some part of me, the part that my mother would recognize, had kept the details quieter than they needed to be. My business made $94,000 in its first 11 months. This was more than I had made in my last year at the architecture firm. It was, to be precise, more than Owen had expected and less than it would be by the end of the following year, but on Christmas Eve, when he stood at the head of our dinner table and announced our end to his assembled family, he believed he was ending a marriage with a woman who had no income, no current professional standing, and no immediate options. He was incorrect about all 3. I stayed with Dara for 5 days. Her apartment is small, and she has a cat named Governor who sat on my chest both mornings I slept in and purred with the focused intensity of an animal who understood what comfort work required. I ate Dara's cooking. I slept 9 hours a night. I cried twice, once on the first night and once on the third. And both times Dara sat beside me and didn't say anything until I was ready to talk, which is the exact, correct thing to do for someone who is grieving something they also know they're better off without. Because that's what it was. Underneath the anger, it was grief. For the marriage I had believed we were building. For the version of Owen I had loved at that conference breakfast in Nashville when we both refused the last cup of coffee. For the life I had reorganized myself around, the career I had paused, the years I had spent trying to be the right kind of daughter-in-law for a woman who had already decided her answer before she met me. Grief is not the same as regret. I want to be clear about that. I have not, for a single day since, regretted leaving. But the sadness was real, and I let it be real instead of burying it under practical action, which took some effort because my instinct when threatened is to get busy. I got busy anyway. I just also let myself be sad at the same time. On the 3rd day I called an attorney, not a friend who happened to be one, not someone Owen and I had used together. My own attorney, someone my cousin had used in her divorce 2 years prior and recommended without reservation. Her name is Helen Marsh, and she has an office in the city, and she answered my email within 4 hours of Christmas. I outlined the situation. I attached a scanned copy of the prenuptial agreement I had photographed with my phone before leaving the house. I outlined the assets I was aware of. I listed the income I had documented from my business. I told her what Owen had said at dinner. She called me the next morning. Her first question was practical. Her second question was whether I had documentation. I did. Her third statement, not a question, was, he initiated. That clause you have is going to matter. Owen texted me the day after Christmas. Then the day after that, I didn't respond. His mother texted me twice. The second message longer, softer in tone, mentioning the silver. His sister texted to say she hoped I was okay, which was kind and probably genuine. She and I had gotten along reasonably well for 4 years. I didn't hold her accountable for what her brother did, and I told her that once, briefly. On the 28th, Owen called, then called again, then texted, "Can you please just let me know you're safe? I am going to be precise about something here." He was not worried I wasn't safe. He was worried about the prenuptial agreement. He was worried because he had talked to his attorney, or his parents had, and someone had looked more carefully at what he'd signed 6 years ago and found the clauses I had requested, and understood what they meant, now that he was the one who had initiated. I know this because he texted, on the 29th, "I think we should talk before either of us involves attorneys." I handed my phone to Helen Marsh, figuratively speaking, meaning I forwarded the message to her. She replied on my behalf. Her client was represented and all communication should go through her office. Owen called 3 more times that day. His mother called once. His father called once, which had never happened in 6 years of knowing him, which told me everything about how the conversations in that house had gone since Christmas Eve. I did not answer any of them. The negotiation took 11 weeks. I will not detail every part of it because some of it is still private and some of it is mine to keep. What I will tell you is this: I walked out of that marriage with my business intact and classified as separate property per the terms we had negotiated. I walked out with a fair settlement on the equity we had built in our jointly owned assets. I walked out with my retirement accounts untouched. I walked out without debt. I walked out with the good silver, which Connie's attorney actually sent a letter about, and which my attorney handled with a 2-sentence response that I still find quietly satisfying. I moved into an apartment in March. It has big windows and a second bedroom I use as an office. I bought my own furniture for the first time since Owen and I had furnished our house together, and the experience of choosing every single piece without consulting anyone else's preferences was something I hadn't anticipated feeling as significant as it did. My business finished the year at $141,000. I brought on an associate in the fall. Noelle and I have dinner every other Sunday. Dara and I have standing Thursday drinks that we almost never actually cancel. I have been going to therapy since February with a woman named Dr. Caswell, who has an uncanny ability to sit with silence and who asked me in our 3rd session when I had last made a decision without wondering what Owen would think of it. I had to think about it for a long time. The answer was, not since I was 23. I'm 31 now. I have a lot of decisions ahead of me. I am making them one at a time without consulting anyone who hasn't earned that. The last thing I'll tell you is about the cobbler. When I came back to the house in January to collect the rest of my things, Owen was not there. We had arranged it that way. I found the cobbler dish in the drying rack by the sink. Someone had washed it. It was the ceramic dish I'd bought specifically for making it, the one I'd seasoned a certain way over several uses. I packed it, not out of spite, not to make a point, because I had earned that dish and the recipe inside my hands and the 3 hours I'd spent the night before Christmas getting the crust right. And those things belonged to me the same way my business belonged to me, and my name belonged to me, and the next 8 years of my life belonged to me, completely and without negotiation. I put it in the box. I carried the box to my car. I drove away. I've had a lot of time to think about what actually happened that Christmas Eve. Not just what Owen did, but what made it possible. What I allowed, quietly, over years, until the allowances had stacked up so high I could barely see over them. Here's what I know now: nobody takes more than you hand them. That's not blame, that's just mechanics. Owen didn't become who he was at that dinner table overnight. He became it gradually, in small moments I told myself didn't matter. The mispronounced name, the seating arrangement, the job I left because someone I trusted asked gentle questions in the right direction at the right time of night. Each one of those moments was a choice point. I chose over and over to smooth things over rather than address them. I was confusing peacekeeping with strength, and they are not the same thing at all. The people who sat at my table that night, who ate the food I'd been preparing for 2 days while knowing what was about to happen, that wasn't cruelty for cruelty's sake. It was entitlement, the assumption that I would absorb whatever was handed to me because I always had before. And the honest thing I have to sit with is that I had given them every reason to believe that was true. What changed wasn't them. It was that I finally stopped. I think about Dara driving to me in 31 minutes without being asked twice. I think about Noelle asking about the roast, specifically because she knew exactly what I needed in that moment and gave it to me. The people who showed up when it mattered had been showing up the whole time. I just hadn't been paying as much attention to them as I had to the people who weren't. That's the thing about spending years trying to earn approval from someone who has already decided their answer. It costs you. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in the slow accumulation of energy spent in the wrong direction. Every hour I spent learning a new recipe to impress Connie was an hour I wasn't investing in my own work, my own friendships, my own clarity about what I actually wanted. And I was talented enough and determined enough that even after all of that, my business still grew to something real. I try not to think too hard about what it might have been if I'd been paying full attention. What I'll say is this: intelligence without honesty is just cleverness. You can be smart enough to read a prenuptial agreement, smart enough to file a business registration, smart enough to see the patterns in other people's behavior, and still spend years lying to yourself about what those patterns mean for you. The hard work isn't the legal documents or the business plan. The hard work is being honest early, even when honesty is inconvenient, even when it disrupts something you've invested in. Even when the person across from you is someone you love. Hadley walked out of that house with a bag, a folder, and a cobbler dish. She didn't have a speech. She didn't perform anything. She just stopped participating in a dynamic that had been costing her for years, and she did it quietly, without waiting for permission or validation. That, I think, is what resilience actually looks like. Not the dramatic stand, the quiet, clear decision to stop, and then the long, steady work of building something true in the space that opens up after.